Does Mavuika actually power creep Xiangling, and if she does, is the Pyro Traveler good enough to justify building to where you don't have to pull Mavuika? Well, I'm going to be here to actually address this topic the best way I can and give you all the information you need, because I've seen some very questionable takes about this, and as someone who wanted Xiangling power creep the most, I think you'll be very interested to hear my takes on this. Happy holidays everyone, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about who's the best Pyro support or sub DPS in Genshin, going over how much damage they do, their supportive utility, their pros and cons, and then some calculations about the teams they fit on. But before we do that, thank you channel members for all your support and the new members who just joined, and also, hi, Mavuika and Sitlali are around the corner, so if you'd like to save yourself some cash, then I'd like to announce the sponsor of today's video, Loot Bar. Loot Bar is a very safe and secure service I've been using for a few months now that some of you may be familiar with, as it allows you to buy Primo Gems at a 23% discount, and it doesn't need any passwords, just your UID and region. So if I just do this, and would you look at that, in only 3 minutes I've received my gems. I got the 3,280 Primo Gem pack at only £36.8, which saves me some money from the original price. This site has also been endorsed by other creators such as Juice, Dukaja, and of course yours truly. Loot Bar essentially will act as a gateway using a VPN to cut down on the cost of gems by removing certain taxes, whilst going through the official top-up methods for the game, which allows you to enjoy the benefits that you'd get in-game like the top-up bonuses. So use my link in the description below to get 8% off a new user coupon on your purchase. Thank you Loot Bar for sponsoring, and with that, let's get back to the video. So I actually haven't talked about Pyro main character's kit on my channel yet, but all you really need to know is that he's kind of like a diet Mavuika. The skill has a tap or hold variant, both of which force you into the Night Soul Blessing state, and have the same Pyro application rate at once every 3 seconds for the next 12 seconds. So that's 4 Pyro applications total. For what variant you should use, just use his hold E, it does more damage and has more range, and then her burst does damage while enabling you to get more Night Soul points so the skill doesn't end prematurely. For the constellations and talents are actually relevant. Aether restores 5 energy when a Pyro reaction is triggered once per skill use, and 4 energy whenever a Night Soul burst is triggered. So even without the scroll set, that is just a free 9 energy refund. For Constellation, C1 gives you a staggering 6% damage bonus to the active character, and 9% for a total of 15% if the character is in a Night Soul Blessing state, because Natlan racism. Constellation 2 helps you maintain a high count of Night Soul points, and the rest of the constellations aren't really that useful as they're all damage increases, and even with them, Lumine doesn't do that much damage. The focal point of Pyro main character is just the fact that they have a Night Soul Blessing and can therefore hold scroll to its full effect. Their Pyro application really isn't that great, nor is their damage, but they can hold scroll, buff slightly, and they apply enough Pyro for most teams. To be honest, compared to the other Travelers, I do think Pyro MC is the best. They don't do much, but they at least have the least amount of gameplay flaws, and because the competition in the Pyro slot is next to nothing, they can stand on their own 2 legs, even against other strong options. And also the scroll set is kind of broken. Moving on, I would assume everyone knows what Xiangling does. At C6, you get 14-second burst uptime, Pyro resistance reduction, and a Pyro damage bonus to characters under her Pyronado. Speaking of her Pyronado, it does very strong off-field damage, and because it snapshots buffs, you are able to stack a fuck ton of things, primarily Bennett's attack buff on it. And the buffs will last the entirety of her Pyronado's uptime even while off-field. I've already made an entire video talking about my problem with Xiangling's kit, which you should watch for more context. But to summarize, Xiangling is a very good unit, but she has a lot of anti-quality of life in her kit, to where it can be very frustrating to play her. But the biggest upside of Xiangling is the fact that her Pyronado and Goba have no ICD, so every time either of them hit, you will apply Pyro, leading you to be able to apply Pyro faster than pretty much every other character in the game, at a rate of more than once a second while Goba is up, and then about once a second when he runs out. Overall, Xiangling is a solid unit, and you'll see how she stacks up later. Lastly, let's quickly go over Mavuika. I have talked about her so many times on this channel already, and I'm sure you know what she does. But for a quick refresher on what's actually going to be important in this video, as I won't talk about her on-field DPS prospects at all, Mavuika's tap skill will apply Pyro on cast, and then she'll apply Pyro 6 times off-field for the next 12 seconds. Then for her burst, the interesting thing is that it doesn't have an energy requirement, it has a fighting spirit requirement of 100, which she will fill 80 of by herself through consuming Night Soul points, and then the rest she has to gain through other Natlan teammates consuming Night Soul, or through normal attacks. And the reason why this is important is that not only is her burst and burst damage tied to how much fighting spirit you have over 100, but she will also provide a damage buff to your active character that is also tied to how much fighting spirit you have. So if you're just barely scraping by with fighting spirit, not only will her damage be less, but the buff your active character receives will also be lower. This is a known factor if your DPS is a Natlin character, as they will all consume enough points to where you are pretty much reaching the max cap, but it can pose a problem when Mavuika is the only Natlin character on your team, and you're using a character that doesn't do a lot of normal attacks, which makes it to where she kind of just doesn't function on a lot of teams universally. But assuming favorable conditions for her, she has pretty good supportive utility and good enough pyro application. But with our fighters now introduced, let's compare them more in depth, starting with their supportive upsides and downsides. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is pyro application, as this just becomes the foundation for the types of teams they can utilize. Starting with the chef, as I said before, Xiangling's pyro application is once every second or even more at the fastest. Mavuika is half that at once every 2 seconds, and Pyro Travler is a very pitiful once every 3 seconds. To be fair, a lot of teams don't actually need that much pyro application than what Pyro MC provides. Like for example, burning teams don't care about pyro application, nor do Chevry's overload teams, to an extent. So for those teams, she can be perfectly used on them, and she should be able to function in Mualani teams in single target. Not in AoE, however, as she will attack faster the more targets there are, so it'll be harder for Pyro MC to keep up in that case. And then past that, Mavuika should be fully capable of supporting Mualani if she's the only Hydro applier on the team. And with Mavuika, she can also aid in melting Wrisley's hits even with solo Pyro, but it will be somewhat inconsistent and it does come at a slight cost. You see, with Xiangling, Wrisley's optimal combo is doing 3 normal attacks and a charge attack, and because of how insane her Pyro application is, Wrisley will very consistently melt all of his meltable hits. But when you're using Mavuika, you will have to use a worse combo to apply less cryo from Mavuika to be able to melt all of his multiple hits. You go from doing a 5 charge attack combo to doing a 3 charge attack combo, otherwise Wrisley applies too much cryo and melting becomes inconsistent. When we get to the comparison portion of the video, this isn't really the worst thing ever, but just an upside to note that Xiangling has. Another upside for the chef is that there's also vape melt teams. That is a type of Wrisley team that is literally in a UFC WWE brawl with itself, with Wrisley, Furina and Xiangling all fighting for vapes and melts. And with how much pyro Xiangling applies, it allows everyone on the team, including herself, to trigger multiplicative reactions consistently. Where with Mavuika's slower application, this just isn't possible, to where she'll be doing most of the multiplicative reactions. To be fair, if you replace Furina with Sit Lolly, this isn't that bad. It creates a Wrisley driving team, where Mavuika's off-field damage is the carry of the team. But when talking about Wrisley teams specifically, I feel like a lot of people would be happy with him doing more damage. So for teams that maximize his damage output, you're less flexible with Mavuika over Xiangling. And also, circling back to Mualani, because Pyronado, most of the popular Mualani teams are double Hydro teams that use characters like Yulan, C6 Candice, and even though there are some inconsistencies in single target, you can also use Furina, who's theoretically the best in this role. And you can use these characters and get very consistent vapes while enabling Mualani to burst every rotation. And these teams just aren't usable at all if you're playing Mavuika instead of Xiangling, as she doesn't have the pyro application for it. And even with the C5 Candice, because Candice applies Hydro once when switching out, you have to do a normal attack with Mavuika to apply pyro so that this one instance of swapping out doesn't mess with your auras, as Mavuika won't be able to flip it back ever if a Hydro aura is established during her skill uptime. The Pyro Archon, ladies, MBs and gentlemen. Xiangling's pyro application just provides such an immense layer of comfort for a lot of teams, enabling even more viable options, and to me is the biggest upside of using her, where with Mavuika you're more limited to the types of teams you can play, and her off-field teams in general require stricter setups and rotations, which in her defense does usually result in you getting a higher damaging team, as you'll see later. The other side to application is also the uptime. Both Mavuika and Pyro Travler last 12 seconds off field, which is 2 seconds shorter than Xiangling's 14 seconds. The chef's uptime being a few seconds longer is both annoying and a blessing depending on the situation. It can be annoying for some carries like Wrisley where your damage window is already over but Xiangling is still applying pyro, so you have to wait a few seconds for it to end so you can get your cryo scroll buff. But at the same time, the extra uptime Xiangling provides can help if you need to make some adaptable changes to your rotation, or in a case I can relate to a lot as a Mualani main, you have to switch targets and want to start the next wave by vaping Mualani's burst, which wouldn't be that possible if Pyronado's duration was shorter. So I don't really think it's that much of a positive or negative in either's case. Also, I'm surprised I haven't complained about it yet, but Xiangling's burst cooldown is 20 seconds. Both Aether and Mavuika comfortably run 18-second rotations, where to burst every rotation, Xiangling will be forced on 20-second or slightly longer rotations. There is a slight workaround to this which I'll touch on in a bit, but usually with Xiangling you are playing 20-second or longer rotations, which holds some characters back. Moving away from pyro application and into the other supportive traits, we can now talk about energy needs or fighting spirit needs in Mavuika's case. Looking at Xiangling first, she needs a lot of energy. The sky is blue, grass is green, we know. For most of her teams where she isn't being consistently funneled or not with Bennett, you will need around 250% ER or more with the Favonius weapon to burst every rotation on her, which hinders her damage potential by a lot and any of the other support sets she could use, in favor of keeping at least 2P's emblem to help her meet her energy needs. Now, something I never thought I would do is give a bone to Xiangling's energy needs, but I do want to sort of defend it, as my opinion has changed the more I've playtested with Xiangling, but there are a few situations you can make where she doesn't need to burst every rotation, and in some cases it's even more optimal than using her burst every rotation. This is the case for mono Pyro teams, Bennettless Chevreuse teams, and some Mualani setups if you have an Onoma unit that can absorb Pyro, and apply it like that. And also, the game isn't played in a simulation. If an enemy has a bit of HP left and you're using a Mualani team for example, Goba applies enough Pyro to where you can usually finish off enemies with it, and save your burst for the next chamber. As I also said before, there really isn't that many teams that demand the amount of application Xiangling with their burst up provides, so if it helps to lessen the burden, you don't necessarily have to use her burst in every situation, on teams where Xiangling is just a Favonius slave. And if you're building her with maximum energy anyways, her damage profile is negligible enough to where your damage isn't going to be too heavily impacted by losing Pyro native. Let's talk about the twins next, in which Travler is a 70 cost burst, and with one proc of the scroll set and both their ascension passives, they're able to reduce their burst cost down to 55. And they also generate 4 particles with their skill. Thankfully, the Traveler's damage profile isn't really all that, and they have to use the scroll set anyway, so their buffing isn't hindered by them needing to build ER, in which they usually need to build 180% to 200% energy to burst off cooldown, and this can be lowered by another 20% if they use the Favonius weapon. And if you're a grandpa that managed to have a festering desire lying around, they can utilize it very well while covering most of their energy needs. Overall, a very good energy economy that doesn't hinder their performance. Lastly, there's Mavuika, whose burst is based on fighting spirit, so she has no energy needs in a traditional sense, and can focus all of her stats into offense. Her maximum burst capacity is 200 fighting spirit, but she'll only need 100 to burst, 80 of which is covered by her consumption of her own Nisal points, and the rest you can gain through consuming other teammates' Nisal or by doing normal attacks. If you are playing any of the Natlan DPS or are using Shilonen on the team, you really have nothing to worry about, but some issues do come into play when you aren't using another Natlan teammate. Even looking at Chlorinde, who does 39 instances of normal attack hits, that is only around 140 fighting spirit, so if you're to slap Mavuika on a Chevreuse team without a Roron or a quick burn team, even though yes you'll be able to burst every rotation, you just won't get the full effects. The reason I'm bringing this up even though you can use a Roron for Chevreuse is because a Roron wasn't given out for free, and he's in the patch right before Mavuika, so realistically not a lot of people are going to have him to where this issue can be solved for them. Wow, I am just never going to speak again. That was the worst voice crack I think I've ever had. This restriction does limit the potential number of teams Mavuika can be played onto strong effectiveness, as unlike Xiangling, she isn't that great or flexible in traditional national team cores, as you won't have someone to charge her burst a lot of the time. At the very least, most national team cores aren't that strong or popular anymore, so I don't think you're losing out on that much in that regard. But if you wanted Mavuika to replace Xiangling in your international teams or Raiden national teams, then that just isn't realistic. Now the last thing they can do to support is their buffing. Oppa is the worst tier out of the 3 for general use, as her buffs are giving a 10% attack buff that you will never really get, and then shredding Pyro resistance and buffing Pyro damage by 15%. So for every non-Pyro damage dealer, she practically does nothing. Now for Aether, I'm just going to assume the scroll set is part of his base kit, as unlike Mavuika or Xiangling, if he isn't using the scroll set, there's basically no point in using him, so they can give a 40% elemental damage bonus, as well as a 6 to 15% damage bonus with his C1. And obviously compared to Xiangling, who basically doesn't buff at all, Lumine would just be a better buffer. Now with Mavuika, she doesn't actually demand use of the scroll set in every single team, because a lot of the time Shilonen or another Natlan support is paired with her, who gain more from using the scroll set while Mavuika can use something like Codex. But for the sake of comparison, Mavuika can use the scroll set on quite a few teams. On top of this, Mavuika has a front-loaded buff of up to 40% at maximum fighting spirit, but this of course isn't actually 40% the entire time as it averages out. So over your carry's damage render, you're looking at closer to a 25% damage buff, and this really isn't that far off from the Traveler. Looking at a Knight team for comparison, the damage amplification they provide on average isn't that different, and PMC can actually be better if they use a supportive weapon like the Peak Patrol Song. But of course, in practice, Mavuika's buff will feel a lot better as it's front-loaded, allowing you to push certain damage breakpoints much faster. So to conclude, Mavuika has the strongest buffing potential out of the bunch, and her buffs will also feel more impactful in practice. Between all 3 of them, Mavuika just has the best supportive quality overall, with the potential to run rotations as short as the Travelers, amplifying damage the most, which is something Xiangling just doesn't have. And even though her fighting spirit economy is bad on teams without another Natling unit, the characters that need a Xiangling replacement the most in Kinich and Muulani are Natling characters, and most of the others can run Shalonen as well, to where it doesn't tend to be a massive issue. But if you don't have any of the other Natling supports, this can be a bigger downside to you. The only thing Mavuika loses to Xiangling over is really her Pyro application. There are just teams where she can't function in the same way Xiangling does, or she just makes the teams more awkward to pilot, and I can't really defend that Mavuika does just limit your options, though at the same time she's able to make stronger teams for most of those characters, which I'll cover shortly after talking about their damage. In terms of damage output, it really is dependent on the scenario to where it's hard to directly compare them and have it be completely fair. In a lot of teams, Xiangling will have to hold Favonius and build high ER, which is something Mavuika never has to worry about in any of her teams, so her damage will be much higher than Xiangling in those cases. But when Xiangling is able to build for catch and have much more manageable energy requirements, then the comparison does become a lot closer. Speaking of which, Mavuika does kind of have gearing issues if you don't buy the battle pass or plantable for a signature weapon, as there aren't that many weapons in the game that are synergistic for her, so for what I calculate, she'll either use an R1 Akumaru or R5 Milled Flower. Just keep in mind that Mavuika's damage can be 20 to 40% higher, depending on if you have a 5-star weapon or Serpent Spine with high refines. Starting with Vape teams, Mavuika is actually very close to Xiangling in terms of damage output, even without being able to snapshot and having Codex not buff all her hits. And unlike Xiangling, since Mavuika applies Pyro once every 2 seconds, slower Hydra applicators would be able to keep up with this as well. There is a technique people asked me to talk about in my last Xiangling video, being double hitting, as you're able to just get more Pyronative swings if the enemy is either big or through doing a technique like so, where with properly timed dashes you'll be able to hit a lot more times. And when factoring scenarios like this in, Xiangling's damage profile will shoot up by a fuck ton, being 60% stronger than just having her standard hits, in which her off-field's damage completely eclipses Mavuika's. I did only look at double hitting for Vape teams, as for other teams you just aren't going to be doing the technique when Xiangling isn't the main source of damage on your team, and in every other scenario Mavuika just does more damage than Xiangling, with Mavuika having even higher DPS as this is factored. You should keep in mind though that for Mavuika to reach this level of damage, this means using her burst inside Bennett's circle, or setting up a Vaporizer Melt if you have those units on your team. Her burst is still a majority of her damage splits compared to her skill, so if you're not capitalizing on this, then you won't get the best results out of your Mavuika. So the same way you snapshot Xiangling inside Bennett's circle, you're also going to want to cast Mavuika's burst inside Bennett's field, and then after that you switch to your main carry. This does mean that Mavuika's damage is a lot more front-loaded compared to Xiangling's, which can either be a positive or negative depending on the content. Pretty much, to summarize, Mavuika more consistently will be the best Pyro sub DPS, due to her not needing to sacrifice her damage from building ER or having to use a Favonius weapon. Xiangling pretty consistently ranks in second, or in Vape teams when implementing double hits can far exceed Mavuika's off-field damage, and then the Traveler's damage profile is just shit. We waited 3 patches for this, by the way. Now let's actually look into some teams and how they compare to each other. The first team I wanted to look at is Kinich teams, as this is just the simplest to compare. It's just a linear progression from Xiangling to Pyro MC to Mavuika. One thing to note about using Mavuika or the Travler on scroll in this team is that applying Dendra or Pyro to a burning aura doesn't count as re-triggering burning. Therefore, past your second rotation, if you're still fighting the same enemy, then you'll just lose your scroll buff. This isn't a massive issue though, and regardless, scroll is still the best set you can use, as it makes your first rotation so strong. The jump from Travler to Mavuika really doesn't end up being that big here, especially with the fact that ultimately Mavuika has to extend rotation slightly, casting her skill and burst at a different time so you can set up the scroll buff early, while still being able to cast her burst inside Bennett's circle. Both of them do end up being a pretty big increase for Kinich though over Xiangling or any other option you could have used before, like Tomaradea. And keep in mind that you do want to have Emily on D-put in this team now, as the Pyro applier no longer holds it. Next up, there are a couple of Risley teams I decided to look at. Comparing both of the reverse melt setups, obviously Mavuika just dunks Xiangling here if she's able to melt all of Risley's hits consistently, although more in-game tested will be needed to see just how consistent this is. However, when looking at Vape melt teams, the gap between Xiangling and Mavuika is a lot closer and pretty much equal. I would honestly argue that the Vape melt teams might even be better in practice, as these longer rotations with more damage per rotation can help you push certain damage breakpoints, where you may need a second rotation on the Mavuika team. So in terms of how good they are for Risley, they are essentially equal, unless you want to count the fucking hilarious Risley driving team, in which Mavuika is better as it's focused around her own damage. I also did try to make Pyro MC work in triple Pyro teams with him and Xiangling, and yeah, Travler fails to meet expectations yet again. On the topic of driving teams, I guess we can talk about national teams, or more specifically international teams, in which I don't really have any math to show you, as I just don't think this team would work with Mavuika. There's the obvious fighting spirit issue. Tartaglia won't generate a lot of fighting spirit for Mavuika. You'll be able to burst every rotation, but you'll basically just be hitting the minimum amount required to burst, lowering Mavuika's potential potential damage by quite a lot. One way to solve this is by using Xiangling over Sucrose or Kazuha, but then that would mean using Child without a grouper, which doesn't sound like the best idea when he has quadratic scaling on his Riptides. On top of an elemental burst that is a big part of his damage that can more consistently hit with grouping on the team. There's also the fact that you lose your super easy access to double buffing setups. Both Mavuika and Tartaglia do a good amount of damage on the team. You want to buff both of them, in which I can think of some ways to double buff them, but then you also have to take into account that their vaped bursts are like most of their damage. So to use Xiangling, you'd have to think of a rotation that would double buff both of them while setting up a vaporize for Tartaglia and Mavuika's bursts. Which is a fantasy, it doesn't exist. Or at least it wouldn't happen very consistently. I just don't see a world in which Mavuika slots well into international over Xiangling and is better. And there's actually zero point in talking about Pyro MC here. So yes, Xiangling is still going to be the international unit. I apologize, child main, just stuck with her till the end of time. Speaking of people who are still going to be stuck with Xiangling, or well, maybe, we have Mualani teams. Now for this section, I want to point out that I didn't do any of the calculations. My friend and fellow theorycrafter Vomfi did them. Go follow his Twitch down below, and let me say he was cooking up something with these Mavuika Mualani teams. Using Yelan, Xiangling, and Xiangling as a baseline because it's the highest DPS Mualani team the most consistently. Mavuika is actually going to be a decent upgrade to Mualani, especially because she enables those shorter rotations that Xiangling couldn't be played on at all. On top of the fact that Mavuika is able to frontload damage through vaping her burst in this team. Theoretically, your best team is going to be Sitlali, Mavuika, Xiangling, with Xiangling on scroll and Sitlali holding instructors and thrilling tales, so she can make Mavuika's burst hit significantly harder. The only issue with this team though is Sitlali's cryo application, so if Sitlali has her second ascension passive, this team becomes very inconsistent, as Mavuika can't handle both Sitlali and Mualani's application. So to play this team, you'd have to keep Sitlali unascended so she doesn't get her ascension 4, and you also have to never burst on her to ensure that you don't reach her nice little point cap. Yeah, I'm not too sure about actually recommending you play this team, but there is a very high chance that this is theoretically the best way to play Mualani. Other than Sitlali, for the other teams you could build that would be better than using Xiangling, you have Zhongli for double Geo, C6 Diona, and Candace. Though only if Candace is C5, as if she's C6, you just can't use them together. Also, just remember you have to set up these vapes or melts for Mavuika's burst in order for her to feel as impactful in these teams, as Mavuika's damage and the shorter rotation times is the difference being made up in these teams. Also, just don't use Pyro MC. They aren't that great, as Xiangling is just a better scroll holder, and they also introduce more inconsistencies with their slower Pyro application, so yeah, just not that great. Thanks again to Vomfi for helping out with this section. Now the last character I wanted to look at was Chlorant's teams, as she's one of the only units that can reach a decent amount of fighting spirit without needing another Nalanina on the team. And this can be good for two types of teams for her, being Quickburn or Chevreuse teams. I didn't feel too confident looking at Quickburn yet, so I did only look at a standard Chevreuse team, replacing your second Pyro unit from Mavuika or Pyro Travler. Also, I know this is supposed to be a Xiangling comparison, but I accidentally calculated for Toma instead. To be fair, it really doesn't matter that much. Xiangling and Toma are pretty similar on this team, and replacing him with Pyro Travler gives you a slight upgrade, but you do lose a shield for a very slight offensive advantage, which may not be that worthwhile to you. Also, after the AM changes, Xiangling, Toma, and Travler all want to run full EM builds. It's the best way to build them for damage on this team. Now, if you add in Mavuika, she will give a much bigger damage increase, even though you do get less fighting spirit on her second rotation, as Mavuika just does a lot more damage than both EM Travler and EM Toma on these teams, while providing the strongest buffs overall. And because Mavuika isn't that heavily tied to the scroll set, if you do happen to have a high constellation Auroron, you can build Mavuika on a more damaging set and give Auroron scroll instead, further pushing this team ahead. So yeah, Mavuika is also really strong here. This is pretty much the only Chevreuse team she can be played well on though. As for Pyro units, she's just worse than having Bennett, and for a Raiden Chevreuse team, she just wouldn't function, as she would give no resolve stacks to Raiden, and likewise Raiden doing burst hits means that she wouldn't give burst stacks to Mavuika. Regardless, still a very big increase for these Chlorant's teams, and not only that, but across the board, Mavuika is just looking to be the best Pyro option we have currently, replacing Xiangling in all of her best use cases, and Pyro Traveler kind of just exists, I guess. Okay, I'm being too harsh, they are actually able to compete with Mavuika and Xiangling on a couple of teams. All in all, as expected, Mavuika is pretty consistently the best Pyro support, doing the most damage most of the time, while providing the strongest supportive benefits. The only real issue with her is that there are certain teams where she can't replace Xiangling due to not having the Pyro application the chef has, or just not being able to generate enough fighting spirit on the team to function well. On top of the fact that her rotations are a lot more complex, I guess is the way to put it, as you have to compensate for her lower skill uptime, on top of the fact that if you want her to do a good chunk of damage, you have to set up scenarios for her burst to either melt, vape, or be used inside Bennett Circle, to where in some teams like the Mualani one, she has to get almost as much attention as your carry. In my opinion, unless you're also going to spec into her on-field playstyle, she really isn't that much of a significant significant increase to most of the characters over Pyro MC or Xiangling to warrant pulling just for her sub DPS prospects. And even when she is better than Xiangling, there are also other supports that can be used. Theoretically, she is massive for a Chlorant Chevreuse team, but Chlorant has one of the most insane rosters of teammate diversity in the game, and pulling a 5-star just for this may not be the best decision for your account if you plan on completely neglecting the other side of her kit. So overall, while she's still objectively the best Pyro off-fielder we have, I wouldn't pull her just for the sake of having a good off-field Pyro unit, unless you really need a second Xiangling and Travler isn't able to take up that slot well. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this topic, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and deeply appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.